It was the kind of silence that comes after a door slams heavy, loaded, still vibrating with everything that had just been said. Ray Manzarek stood in the narrow corridor backstage at the Aquarius Theatre in Los Angeles, 1969. His hands were at his sides. The fluorescent light above him buzzed without mercy. He had just walked out of a room where Jim Morrison was sitting alone, surrounded by empty bottles and the particular darkness that had been gathering around him for months now. Not dramatic darkness, not poetic darkness, but the slow, grinding kind that wears a man down from the inside. Ray had said the words. He had rehearsed them, or something like them, for weeks. He had stood there and looked at Jim and told him calmly, quietly, with the exhaustion of someone who had loved the same impossible thing for too long, that he did not know how much longer he could do this. Jim had not reacted. He had not gotten angry. He had not wept or argued or reached for that particular charm that could, even now, disarm almost anyone in the room. He had simply looked at Ray with those dark eyes and nodded very slightly, as if the news was not news at all, as if he had been waiting for it. And that was the moment Ray Manzarek realized something he would carry for the rest of his life. Jim Morrison had already known they were losing each other. He had known it longer than any of them. But to understand what that night meant, you have to go back. You have to go back to the beginning of something that most people have only seen from the outside. The story of the Doors begins, famously, on a beach. It was 1965, Venice Beach, California. Jim Morrison was 21 years old, recently dropped out of UCLA's film school, living on rooftops and in borrowed rooms, eating little, reading everything. He was thin and electric, and not yet the person the world would come to know. Ray Manzarek was older by a few years, already steady in the ways that Jim was not. He had studied classical piano, had a musician's discipline built into the architecture of his hands. When he encountered Jim on that beach, Jim, who began reciting lines of poetry he had been writing in notebooks that lived stuffed beneath a mattress, Ray heard something that stopped him cold. It was not the poetry exactly, though the poetry was extraordinary. It was the sound of a voice that had decided not to perform. Jim Morrison recited those lines, the way people speak when no one is supposed to be listening. And that quality, that paradox of a man, born for stages, who seemed always to be speaking to himself, would become the defining tension of everything that followed. Ray Manzarek looked at Jim Morrison on that beach and made a decision. He said, quietly, that if they formed a band together, they could make $1 million. Jim laughed, but something had already been agreed between them. What nobody talks about is what those early years cost Ray Manzarek. People remember the founding myth, the beach, the meeting of two artistic sensibilities that should not have fit together but did. They remember the genius of the keyboard lines Ray constructed bass and melody simultaneously, filling the sonic space where a bass guitarist would normally stand, creating a sound that was unlike anything that existed before in rock music. What they do not talk about is that Ray spent those years functioning as the steadying force inside a situation that had no natural equilibrium. He was the one who showed up to the studio on time. He was the one who negotiated, who managed, who translated Jim's chaotic creative energy into something that could be recorded and released and listened to by the rest of the world. He did this not reluctantly, but because he believed. He believed in Jim with the particular intensity of someone who has looked at another person and recognized something irreplaceable. And Jim wrote songs. Jim stood at microphones and opened something in the air around him. Jim wrote lyrics that sounded like they had been pulled from the unconscious directly, bypassing the rational mind entirely. Light my fire. People are strange. The end. Riders on the storm. Songs that did not simply exist in the culture, but seemed to reshape the emotional atmosphere of wherever they were played, as if the notes were rearranging the molecules in the room. There was never a question that the talent was real. The question, the one that kept Ray awake in the years before that corridor, before that night in 1969, was whether talent alone could hold a man together. And the answer, increasingly, appeared to be no. Jim Morrison had always carried something heavy. People who knew him in those early years describe a man of stunning contradictions. He could be the most present, most attentive person in any room, listening, asking questions that cut straight to the center of things, remembering details about people's lives months after they had mentioned them. He was widely, voraciously read. He loved Rimbaud and Nietzsche and the Greek tragedians and the films of Ingmar Bergman and the poetry of William Blake, and he carried all of it inside him, not as intellectual decoration, but as genuinely operating furniture of the mind. And yet there was something that could not be reached by any of it. People close to him struggled to name it precisely. It was not depression in any clinical sense they recognized. It was not simple self-destruction, though self-destruction was certainly part of the picture. It was more like Jim Morrison had arrived in the world with a volume turned up inside him that normal life could not accommodate, a sensitivity so acute that the ordinary instruments of existence, conversation, routine, the passage of days, was simply not sufficient containers for what he experienced. The stage helped. When Jim walked onto a stage, something transformed. Not performed transformation, the real thing. The weight he carried seemed to find an outlet, a shape, a structure it could pour itself into. The audience was not merely watching him, they were participating in something he needed to complete. And he gave them everything he had for it. Every single time. But the stage ended. The lights went down, and Jim Morrison walked back into his own life. And whatever the music had briefly resolved, returned unresolved, heavier perhaps for having been lifted. Ray Manzarek watched this cycle for years. He watched it with growing love and growing alarm, and the particular anguish of someone who can see exactly what is happening, but has no instrument to intervene. By 1969, the Doors were famous in a way that had changed the nature of their existence. They had released 4 albums. They had played festivals that drew hundreds of thousands. Jim's face was on posters in teenage bedrooms across the country and across Europe. He was discussed by literary critics and cultural theorists as something more than a rock musician. Norman Mailer had written about him. Poetry journals had taken notice. And Jim Morrison was quietly, steadily, becoming someone Ray barely recognized. It was not dramatic. It was incremental. A version of Jim that appeared more often than it used to. The version that was unreachable, that sat in rooms like a man waiting for something he could not name, that reached for bottles not with the reckless joy of early excess, but with the grim determination of someone who has decided on a method and is executing it. Robbie Krieger, the band's guitarist, felt it too. So did John Densmore, the drummer, whose own relationship with Jim would develop its own particular fractures over these years. But it was Ray who bore the weight of it most directly, because Ray was the one who had built the dream in the first place, who had stood on the beach and heard the poetry and made the decision. Ray was the one for whom the whole thing had begun as a vision of something possible. And now he was standing in corridors, watching that vision crack. What happened between Ray Manzarek and Jim Morrison in 1969 was not a single confrontation. History compresses these things, but people who were close to the band described something more gradual, a series of conversations, some gentle and some not, in which Ray tried to find a way through to Jim. And Jim received these attempts with a mixture of genuine gratitude and profound, helpless distance. Jim knew. This is what Ray would say decades later, in interviews and writings, and the long reflections of a man who had survived his friend and carried that survival as both gift and burden. Jim knew everything that was happening to him. He was not unaware. He was not lost in delusion. He was, if anything, too clear-eyed about his own condition, and that clarity, paradoxically, seemed to offer him no rescue from it. In one exchange that has been recounted by those present, Ray sat with Jim in a dressing room and spoke plainly. He talked about what the band had built together. He talked about what he believed was still possible, that they could make more records, that Jim's voice and Jim's words were still extraordinary, that none of it had to end the way it seemed to be ending. Jim listened. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, with a quality of attention that could make you feel, for a moment, that nothing else existed. Then he said something that Ray never forgot. He said that he understood everything Ray was saying. He said that he wished, more than Ray could know, that understanding was sufficient. And then he looked away. That moment, that turning away, is what Ray Manzarek carried into the corridor that night at the Aquarius Theatre. Carried it, and felt its weight, and stood beneath the fluorescent light, and tried to understand what it meant that two people could love the same dream, and both be insufficient to save it. The Doors continued. They made more music. LA Woman, the album that many critics now consider among their finest, was recorded in the early months of 1971, and Jim Morrison brought to those sessions a voice that had thickened and deepened with time, a voice that carried in it something beyond technical beauty. He sang Riders on the Storm. He sang Love Her Madly. He sang The Changeling. And Ray sat at his keyboards and listened to that voice fill the room, and felt the same thing he had felt on Venice Beach 6 years before. Something irreplaceable. Jim Morrison died in Paris in July of 1971. He was 27 years old. Ray Manzarek was in Los Angeles when he received the news. He did not speak publicly about his immediate reaction, and those who knew him in those days describe a man who went very quiet, not the quiet of someone withholding emotion, but the quiet of someone for whom the ordinary emotional vocabulary had suddenly proven inadequate. He had loved Jim Morrison. He had believed in him absolutely, and tried to protect him, and fought with him, and stood in corridors outside rooms where Jim sat alone, and none of it had been enough. And now, there was no more corridor, no more room, no more chance. In interviews over the following decades, Ray returned again and again to the music, not as escape, but as evidence. He talked about what Jim had made, what they had made together, and he did so with a consistent conviction that the work was more than the story around it, that the songs existed on their own terms, carried their own truth, would outlast any narrative imposed upon them. He was right. The Doors' music did outlast everything. It found new generations who had not been born when the songs were recorded, who heard Riders on the Storm, or When the Music's Over, or Break On Through, and felt something shift inside them, some door open, as the name had always promised. Ray Manzarek spent the remaining decades of his life honoring that music. He wrote about Jim. He performed with different configurations of the band's surviving members. He spoke at universities and in documentaries and in the long, reflective conversations that serious music journalists sought from him. And he always came back to the same point. Jim Morrison was the most gifted person he had ever known. And the music was the proof. Not the legend, not the mythology, not the beautiful tragic story that the culture had constructed around a man who died at 27. The music, the actual songs, the actual words, the actual voice on those recordings that even now, decades later, sounds like nothing else in the world. Ray Manzarek died in 2013, 42 years after Jim Morrison. He had built a full life in those years: family, continued music, a rich creative existence that existed on its own terms and not merely as aftermath. But people who knew him say that Jim Morrison was never far from his thoughts, and that the question he could never answer was one he carried quietly until the end. What remains is the music, those songs that began on a beach in Venice, when a young man with a notebook recited unfinished lines, and another young man stopped walking and listened. The lights never fully went out. The music remained, and in the music, so did Jim.